So you just got a new camera, you're ready to start filming, you turn it on, now what? Let me help you with that. Huh? Hey everybody, my name's JD and I'm a filmmaker, and I'm here to give you some basic tips on camera settings. So for every camera, there's about 5 main settings you need to know when you're filming. You got aperture, shutter speed, ISO, frame rates, and color balance. Those are kind of the main 5. Here's a quick rundown of each one and why they're important when you're filming videos. Alright, number 1, aperture. The aperture is the setting that controls the exposure of your image. Now the size of the aperture on your camera is expressed in f numbers. So the higher the number, the less light. The lower the number, the more light. So right now in this video, I'm shooting at an f-stop of 2.2. So that lets in a lot of light, and that's why you got this nice shallow depth of field. You got a nice little blurry background. It looks all cinematic. So whether you're shooting in low light situations or you want that nice depth of field, that's when you want a lower f-stop. And you'll want to use a higher f-stop when you're in a very bright sunny setting, or if you don't want that shallow depth of field, like you're trying to shoot an establishing shot and you want a lot of detail, you don't want anything to be blurry. So now into number 2, shutter speed. The aperture lets you decide how much light comes in, and the shutter speed lets you decide how long. So with the low shutter speed, that's when you have longer exposure, and that's when you get that blurry, kind of dreamlike look. You've seen it in a lot of movies or music videos. And with a higher shutter speed, that's used for, shooting at a higher frame rate, because you want no motion blur. You want to see every frame nice and clear. The general rule for shutter speed setting is whatever frame rate you're shooting at, you want to double that number for your shutter speed. Unless of course you're looking for that stylistic thing where you want that blurry or you don't want any motion blur. That's when you can play with the shutter speed. Number 3, ISO. So the ISO determines how sensitive the camera sensor is. I kind of think of the ISO as like a digital brightening setting. So the higher your ISO, the brighter, and the lower the ISO, the darker. Generally, you want to keep your ISO fairly low, because the higher it gets, you'll see a little bit of graininess in your footage, and you don't want that. It's okay if there's a little, if it's very subtle, that's fine. With new cameras now, it's a lot easier to bump your ISO higher without any noise, but you can still get there, so you just be careful when you're bumping up or adjusting your ISO. But usually you'll want to focus on your aperture and your shutter speed as the main point of getting your lighting to where it is, and the ISO is just more like the little tweaker to just get it to where you need it to be. Number 4, frame rates. Generally, film is shot at 24 frames per second. So in 1 second, there's 24 frames. Most people think of 24 frames as the most cinematic. So with 24 frames per second, that's like the human eye. You get the natural motion blur, and the higher you go, the less motion blur, because you're shooting more frames, right? So if you're shooting a standard film, you'll want to shoot it at about 24 frames per second, maybe 30 if you're really feeling it. But I would stick to 24 frames per second. But if there's a part of your film you want to shoot in slow motion, or you want to get more frames, that's when you bump the frame rate up to about 60 frames. You can even get to 120 frames per second. And that way when you slow it down, it's nice and crisp. No motion blur. You can see every frame. You get to look like this. That was stupid. So basically the rule of thumb is stick to 24 frames per second when you're shooting films, but if you're shooting certain scenes that need to be in slow motion, that's when you want to bump it up to about 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second if you can. All right, number 5, color balance. Not color balance, white balance, idiot. Number 5, white balance. So once you've got all those other settings perfect and you're looking at your footage and the color just doesn't look like what you're seeing, in real life. The white balance setting on every camera, it'll just have a little symbol showing what type of lighting situation you're in. So whether you're in sunlight, overcast, dark, like you're indoors and there's certain lighting, you got tungsten, fluorescent lighting. So you'll want to adjust that accordingly to whatever lighting setup you're in. So right now I'm inside with fluorescent lighting, and that's what I've changed my settings to. You basically want your white balance to match as close as possible to what it looks like to your natural eye. And then when you color grade out there, it's not too hard to adjust. Whereas if you have the wrong white balance, then your footage might be too yellow or too blue, and then you have to really just counter correct it to get it to where you want it to be. But that's really it. For beginners, those are the main settings you need to know. Once you master those, you'll be cruising. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. And if you have any questions, comment them down below and I'd be happy to make another video about it. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time.